La nefasta labor obstruccionista de la mayoría de congresistas, identificados con intereses racistas y sociales en general, ha logrado crear el caos con el fin de asumir el gobierno al margen de la voluntad popular y del orden constitucional.
In the course of a single morning, in a dizzying period of about 3 hours, Peru experienced an attempted coup d'etat, the arrest of its president, and the swearing in of a successor to re-establish constitutional order. It was perhaps the shortest and worst executed coup attempt of all time. However, this whole story goes far beyond Pedro Castillo, because in reality this is the story of Peru's political decline, a story of hatred, confrontation, disloyalty, and the ambition for power. Let's get cracking. What pushed former President Pedro Castillo to carry out such an act of institutional subversion? Was he really able to dissolve Congress? Why did his attempt fail? And perhaps the most important question of all, what exactly is going on with Peruvian politics that is going from bad to worse? Is Castillo the only one to blame? Well, VisualPolitik viewers, in this video we're going to answer all of these questions, but first we need to establish a few things. Pedro Castillo, a humble rural school teacher from one of the poorest areas of Peru, with a strong anti-establishment discourse and no political or management expertise, was sworn in as president on 28th of July 2021.
Esta vez un gobierno del pueblo ha llegado para gobernar con el pueblo y para el pueblo. Es la primera vez que nuestro país será gobernado por un campesino, una persona que pertenece, como muchos de los peruanos, a los sectores oprimidos por tantos siglos.
However, he barely held the presidency for 495 full days. That is less than a year and a half. In the 2021 presidential elections, Castillo went to the second round with just 18.9% of the vote and managed to win by a slim margin of just over 40,000 out of the nearly 19 million votes cast. He won thanks to a runoff against Coup Fujimori, the daughter of the imprisoned former president Alberto Fujimori, who was rejected by half the country. Be that as it may, it seemed clear from the beginning that despite his grand promises, Castillo was going to have a very, very difficult time.
He is a president who took office with a very low level of support. He did not have a political party. He had a hard time putting together a cabinet. The cabinet has changed constantly, and there has been a constant power struggle with Congress. Flavia Friedenberg, political scientist at the National Autonomous University of Mexico.
Without political experience, without a clear plan, and faced with a head-on rejection by the parliament, the little more than 16 months that Castillo was at the helm of the country were a disaster. In only 495 days, this president had 5 governments and 78 different ministers. Appointments were made practically every week. Only one person, Roberto Sanchez, Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism, managed to remain in office during all of that time. Others were dismissed or resigned amid scandals and misunderstandings of all kinds. Some portfolios, as important in Peruvian politics as the Ministry of the Interior or the Ministry of Agriculture, have seen 7 and 6 ministers respectively. Remember that this was in less than a year and a half. It's total madness. Pedro Castillo changed government more times than he changed socks. Obviously, with so much back and forth in practice, any government action was impossible. And that's not all. On top of this shifting context, we have to add to a Congress that decided to make his life impossible. The incompetence and lack of planning in a president who was alternating between Marxist and conservative supporters, and as if that were not enough, a bunch of corruption investigations that mired him even further. In fact, in October 2022, we find this news. Check this out.
The Peruvian Public Prosecutor's Office denounces President Pedro Castillo and accuses him of leading a criminal organization. The prosecutor claims that the plot is entrenched in the government palace with the aim of monopolizing, controlling, and directing contracting processes to obtain illicit profits.
In total, Castillo, his wife, his sister-in-law, and 2 nephews were facing a total of 6 separate investigations into influence peddling, irregular contracting, bribery, and even plagiarism, among other possible crimes. In short, Pedro Castillo's term as president has been a lengthy torture both for himself and for the country as a whole. We're talking about nearly 200 political scandals of all kinds in less than 500 days. And so, VisualPolitik viewers, this is how we arrive at the 7th of December 2022, on the day which Castillo blew up his presidency. But why did he do it? What exactly did it consist of? Was it really, as so many have suggested, an attempt to carry out a new socialist revolution in Latin America? And why did this act of institutional subversion fail? Well, let's find out.
The non-coup d'etat.
In only 16 months, the Peruvian Congress carried out 3 presidential vacancy processes against Pedro Castillo. presidential vacancy, which is something like a vote of no confidence, is the mechanism that the Peruvian constitution provides to Congress for deposing president for a range of reasons, among them moral incapacity, which of course can mean practically anything. In other words, the parliament has a free hand to pursue presidents in an endless succession of motions of censure.
Llevamos más de 16 meses de continua y obcecada campaña de ataque sin cuartel a la institución presidencial. Situación nunca antes vista en la historia peruana.
Well, the fact is that the first two attempts failed, and the third attempt, which was to be voted on Wednesday the 7th of December, was going the same way. However, that same Wednesday, early in the morning, something happened. The former Chief of Staff for the Ministry of Housing, Salatil Marufo, testified before a Congressional Investigative Committee. He stated that both then Housing Minister, Jennifer Alvaro, and himself made recurring payments to both Castillo and Castillo's sister in exchange for keeping their posts. The money allegedly came from Sada Gore, a real estate businesswoman, and was mainly used to pay bribes and campaign for the president. You know, the Ministry of Housing and a real estate entrepreneur. You can join the dots. Whether or not this statement is true, the fact is that from this point on, events unfolded rapidly. Perhaps they feared that this statement would end up getting enough votes in Congress to approve the vacancy proposal. Who can say? But at 10:46, Castillo's Prime Minister, Betsy Chavez, made an urgent call through the WhatsApp group that members of the government shared, asking the ministers to come as soon as possible because this would be an historic day. Shortly thereafter, a trembling Castillo appeared on television to announce the political bombshell.
Tomamos la decisión de establecer un gobierno de excepción orientado a restablecer el Estado de Derecho y la democracia, a cuyo efecto se dictan las siguientes medidas: disolver temporalmente el Congreso de la República e instaurar un gobierno de emergencia excepcional, convocar en el más breve plazo a elecciones para un nuevo Congreso con facultades constituyentes para elaborar una nueva constitución en un plazo no mayor de 9 meses. A partir de la fecha y hasta que se instaure el nuevo Congreso de la República, se gobernará mediante decretos ley.
Without any constitutional capacity to do so, Castillo announced the dissolution of Congress, the establishment of a government of exception, a curfew, and the reorganization of the justice system. It was what many, including the country's own constitutional court, called an attempted coup d'etat.
Lo que nosotros hemos señalado en primer lugar es que se ha producido un golpe de Estado. El señor Pedro Castillo está al margen de la Constitución y la ley. Nadie debe obediencia a un gobierno usurpador.
This is important to note. Contrary to what has been said, Castillo's action had nothing to do with any kind of socialist revolution, but his goal was to stay in power, escape the prosecution's accusations, and sidestep the blockade of Congress.
He had no constitutional basis for what he did. He found out that in Congress, they already had 87 votes to vacate him, and he mistakenly believed that the population, the armed forces, and the national police were going to support him, and that was not the case. Gustavo Adriansen, the former Minister of Justice.
At the end of her speech, both the Prime Minister and 9 other members of the cabinet announced their resignations. For their part, the country's main institutions, Congress, the army, the police, and the judiciary, made it clear that they would not abide by the president's plan under any circumstances. And so, barely an hour after proclaiming the closing of Congress, Castillo left the presidential palace with his family and his lawyer and former Prime Minister. At 1:40 p.m, less than 2 hours after giving his speech, the Congress simultaneously dismissed him and the president was formally detained. Castillo attempted to reach the Mexican embassy, which was unsuccessful. His own bodyguards, by direct order of the police leadership, stopped the van in which the president was being transported and proceeded to arrest him. But at this point, the question is, why did this subversion fail? Why did it last barely as long as a couple of episodes of The West Wing? The truth is that the Peruvian president's strategy was as incompetent as his government was. Nothing new under the sun. There was no plan, there was no justification, he had no supporters, the majority of his ministers didn't even know about it. Absolutely nothing had been prepared. The chief of the Joint Command of the Armed Forces, General Manuel Gómez de la Torre, confirmed the former president never asked for their support. Castillo was practically alone and fortunately did not try very hard to rally support. He was a man absolutely overwhelmed by events. Rather than a coup d'etat, you could almost call this like improvised nonsense. It's a sketch. Of course, at the international level, it was much the same story. Perhaps the only exceptions might be Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Luis Arca.
We consider it regrettable that due to the interests of the economic and political elites, since the beginning of Pedro Castillo's legitimate presidency, an atmosphere of confrontation and hostility has been maintained against him, to the point of leading him to make decisions that have served his adversaries to consummate his dismissal with the sui generis precept of moral incapacity. Andrés Manuel López Obrador on Twitter. From the beginning, the Peruvian right wing tried to overthrow a government democratically elected by the people, by the humble classes who seek more inclusion and social justice. Luis Arce, president of Bolivia.
But wait a minute, because this is not the end of the story. Castillo is guilty, but he's not the only guilty party. Peru's problem goes far beyond the former president. Check this out.
The political Titanic that is Peru.
After 3 no-confidence processes in just 16 months, and while Pedro Castillo will be prosecuted for rebellion and perhaps also for conspiracy, Peru has a new president, Dina Boluarte. Castillo's vice president resigned after the coup attempt and was very clear in condemning her former political partner.
There has been an attempted coup d'etat, an imprint promoted by Mr. Pedro Castillo, which has not found an echo in the institutions of democracy or in the street. This Congress of the Republic, following the constitutional mandate, has made a decision, and it is my duty to act accordingly. Dina Boluarte, vice president of Pedro Castillo and the new president of Peru.
The new president has asked Parliament for a political truce and has promised to establish a government of national unity in which all political forces are represented. This has apparently been well received by the political groups.
This is not a time for ideologies, neither of left or right. President Boluarte, we wish you success in forming a government of national unity. Keiko Fujimori.
But what can I say? It is almost certain that the new president will again have practically the same problem as Castillo had, including an investigation for money laundering. Her problems may even end up being worse because her profile is much more ideological and much more to the left. However, Peru's problem was not exclusively Castillo's, but above all, the persistent political catastrophe the country is experiencing. Boluarte is the 6th president the country has had in the last 5 years. Congress has practically refused to work loyally with any of the country's past presidents. And take note, because if there is one thing Congress is doing, it is monopolizing more and more power, to the point that the executive is becoming an irrelevant player, practically a punching bag. In fact, one law that was passed in October 2021 had a lot to do with this political crisis. We are talking about Law 31355, a law that basically splits the balance of power between the government and the Congress. Let me explain. In Peru, the Congress has the ability to dismiss the president. At the same time, the government has the ability to dissolve the Congress and call for legislative elections if the chamber denies the government's 2 motions of new confidence. However, since the approval of Law 31355, the power has disappeared in practice. And of course, this means that if the government does not have a parliamentary majority, as is often the case in Peru, where the parliament is almost always very fragmented, then the government's hands are completely tied. It cannot pass anything and cannot put pressure on the legislators.
Porque el Congreso actual ha roto el equilibrio de poderes, porque ha hecho una interpretación a su manera en la Constitución y sin cambiar la Constitución, con una ley la ha interpretado.
The first thing to understand is that the optional question of confidence, the one requested by the government, has been greatly reduced. In practice, the president could never dissolve Congress. Ana Neira, lawyer and professor of constitutional law at the Universidad del Pacífico.
And guess what? The breakdown in the balance of power is directly connected with the disaster that has been the Castillo administration. Congress has been able to make life impossible for the government without the slightest consequence. In other words, the checks and balances of government have disappeared. This, for example, has caused Congress to sideline almost 70 bills put forward by the government, and perhaps that is why the disapproval rating of Congress is almost 90%. That's quite a record. And to tell the truth, it does not bode well for future governments. But keep in mind, this is not only a strictly political or electoral issue. Practically all of Pedro Castillo's predecessors since the Fujimori era have been prosecuted for corruption. Shall we take a look? Then let's check it out. Fujimori is in jail for corruption and crimes against humanity. Alan Garcia ended his life in 2019 while he was being detained, following the Obrecht scandal. Alexandro Todeo is wanted and is in exile in the United States while he faces an extradition request. Oliana Humala is being prosecuted. Kaczynski, much the same story. And now Castillo, in addition with corruption investigations, also faces the possible crime of rebellion. That means he could be facing many years in prison. In general, it's a real disaster. Politics in Peru is becoming more and more unstable and radicalized. And obviously, that has consequences.
It is obvious that political stability affects investor confidence. It makes them hesitate. If there is no confidence, or it's been undermined, then obviously the investment rate is not going to progress. Kurt Bernio, former Peruvian finance minister.
At the moment, growth expectations for 2023 are being reduced to around 2.5%, and ratings agencies such as Fitch have recently revised the country's outlook from stable to negative. The times when Peru was the engine of Latin America and a strong candidate for becoming a regional powerhouse seem to be a thing of the past. I'll leave a link in the description for a video in which we describe in detail why Peru is getting worse and worse. But now, it's over to you. What do you think will happen with the new Peruvian government? How do you rate Castillo's time in office? What do you think needs to change in his country for it to become the engine of Latin America once more? Leave us your answers in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, and I'll see you next time.